Piles of bodies everywhere, some covered with lime and others partially incinerated on pyres. These were the testimonies of the U.S. forces upon liberating Ohrdruf, a sub-concentration camp of Buchenwald. The ghastly nature of these discoveries compelled General D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, to visit the camp 8 days after its liberation. In his own words, he undertook the visit to have first-hand evidence of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, thus leaving no room to dismiss their cruelty as mere propaganda. While much has been said about the atrocities inflicted by the Nazis upon the Jewish people, it is important to remember that both men and women were victims of their horrors. However, women experienced these horrors in distinct ways. The regime subjected the women to brutal persecutions unique to their gender. Sadly, little has been said about these gender-specific persecutions. So in this video, I will shed light on 9 unspeakable acts the Nazis did to Jewish women. 1. Gas chamber and mass murders. In the wake of the June 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union, a horrifying chapter of Nazi brutality unfolded as Einsatzgruppen, aka Death Squad units, carried out mass shootings of civilian women and children. The Nazis sought more efficient methods for mass killing. Enter the gas vans, a macabre invention designed for the sole purpose of extermination. These hermetically sealed trucks featured an interior compartment where the engine exhaust was diverted. The use of gas vans began when members of the Einsatzgruppen expressed their battle fatigue and mental anguish caused by the sheer magnitude of shooting large numbers of women and children. The Nazis started to discover that the gassing method was a more efficient and cost-effective method of killing Jewish women. These death squads utilized gas vans to carry out the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly targeting Jews. The gas vans became yet another tool in the Nazis' genocidal campaign, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable suffering and loss. By 1942, the Nazis started to initiate systematic mass killings in stationary gas chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. They used carbon monoxide gas created by diesel engines to carry out these dastardly acts. The victims were deceived into believing they were entering showers for disinfection. They were then packed tightly into the chambers, resulting in suffocation. In Ravensbrück, which was the largest women's internment camp and not initially designed specifically as a killing center, the gas chamber was relatively small and used to kill women, especially pregnant women whom the Nazis felt were unfit for work. In these camps, instead of carbon monoxide, they used Zyklon B, which was a highly poisonous insecticide that was originally used to kill insects and rats. However, when Zyklon B is exposed to air, it converts into a lethal gas. This gas proved to be the quickest gassing method, so it became chosen as the means of mass murder also in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, almost all of the 1.3 million individuals suffered a tragic fate, many of them falling victim to the gas chambers. Among the grim estimates, over 1 million of those who perished in Auschwitz were Jewish, and half of them were women. 2. Ghettos. One of the key steps that the Nazis took to brutally separate, persecute, and ultimately destroy the Jews, especially women, was to move them forcefully to ghettos. The ghettos were enclosed districts designed to intern the Jews and keep them from contacting the outside world. The first ghetto was established in Poland, Piotrkow Trybunalski, on October 1939. They were initially designed to be temporary. However, while some of the ghettos lasted from a few days to weeks, other ghettos lasted for several years. The Nazi Germans used the ghettos as provisional measures to first control and segregate the Jews, as the Nazi leadership deliberated the options of removing the Jewish population. But the women were at a disadvantage. The Jews did not believe that the Nazis were going to attack women. They thought they were civilized. So, when anti-Semite propaganda and riots started, men faced the constant threat of deportation to forced labor camps or brutal physical labor, often accompanied by abuse from German or Polish supervisors. So, they tried to remain indoors during daylight hours. As a result, women took on a multitude of chores, braving the outside world on behalf of their families. They traded personal belongings for food, waited in long lines at the Judenrat headquarters to retrieve their confiscated possessions, and organized the repair of damaged businesses. While this was commendable for the women, it made them sitting ducks for the Nazis. The German occupation imposed a series of regulations on the Jews within the ghettos. One of the most chilling methods of control was the requirement for Jews to wear identifying badges or armbands. To enforce the German authorities' orders, a ghetto police force and Jüdisch Council, also known as Judenräte, was established. They ironically were also Jews who had to make sure that the ghettos complied with the directives of the Germans under the threat of death. In the face of unimaginable oppression, Jews responded with a variety of courageous acts of defiance. Ghetto residents displayed extraordinary resourcefulness, often smuggling vital supplies such as food, medicine, weapons, and intelligence across the ghetto walls. Fueled by the desire for survival and the sustenance of the people within the confines of the ghetto, these acts acts were carried out often without the approval or the knowledge of the Jewish Council. Some Jewish Council officers knew about the smuggling and tolerated or even encouraged smuggling, sometimes turning a blind eye or discreetly endorsing the acts of resistance. While the Germans displayed little concern about religious worship or cultural events within the ghetto walls, they viewed social gatherings as potential security threats. A few female-led resistances were initiated. For example, in Bialystok, a Jewish woman named Heike Grossman was pivotal to the organization of underground movements within the Bialystok ghetto. She was the link between the Bialystok ghetto to other resistance networks. However, with a ruthless resolve, the Germans would swiftly incarcerate or even kill those they deemed as potential threats to their control, including women like her. 3. Concentration camps. From the ghettos to the concentration camps. Between 1938 and the surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945, Nazi Germany implemented a system of internment that targeted Jews, political dissidents, resistance fighters, Romani, and many others. Men and women were forcibly rounded up and interned within the barbed wire fences of these bleak concentration camps. The Nazis devised sinister means to get the women into these camps. For example, in 1942, they created rumors in Humene that unmarried Jewish women were being summoned to the town's registration office with the promise of work opportunities. The women went blinded by the hope of a basic salary, which was hard for Jewish women in 1942. Little did they know that it was a cunning effort to lure the women into concentration camps. Hundreds of girls from that small town alone were bundled onto a train to Propad barracks, where they were fed starvation rations and were ordered to sanitize the barracks on their hands and knees. From Propad, the girls were bundled again starving and under immense psychological and physiological trauma to Auschwitz. This journey, the journey of over 999 Jewish women, is one of the first officially recorded Jewish transport to the notorious Auschwitz camp. Once in these internment camps, the men and women were separated into different sections of the camp. Some individual camps were designated specifically for female prisoners. One of those camps was the Ravensbrück camp. Ravensbrück was the largest Nazi concentration camp that was established for women. At the time of its liberation, the Ravensbrück camp had incarcerated more than 100,000 women. Then Budi was created as a sub-camp within what the Nazis called interest zones. At Budi, there were two distinct women's camps. The first was a women's penal company, established as a form of punishment within the concentration camp system. It came into existence in the summer of 1942, when a prisoner escaped from her work detail, leading to collective punishment for approximately 200 women. Women sent to the penal company endured brutal treatment, serving sentences for offenses committed within the camp. These offenses ranged from escape attempts to minor infractions like unauthorized letters or altering the camp's uniform. The death rate in the penal company remained tragically high. By the spring of 1943, the entire penal company was transferred to the women's camp, known as Frauenkonzentrationslager, in Auschwitz II Birkenau. Meanwhile, on April 5, 1943, the SS established a separate women's camp at Budi, where an additional 200 mostly Polish women were sent. The number of prisoners fluctuated over time, reaching 455 in March 1944, as documented. The women in these camps went through untold hardships and were faced with daily horrors. They were stripped of their dignity and were subject to all kinds of physical and psychological torment. Living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, the interned women were malnourished, plagued by disease, and lived in constant fear for their lives with the gas chambers just around the corner. 4. Experimentation. Thousands of Jewish women were taken from prisons and ghettos to a concentration camp in Ravensbrück. Over 130,000 women were sent to Ravensbrück, but by the end of the war, only 8,000 of them survived. Set up in 1939, Ravensbrück was exclusively for women. Between 1942 and its closure in April 1945, the camp became the site of horrific medical experiments conducted by the Nazis. These experiments aimed to test the effectiveness of sulfonamide drugs. They were a unique group. Prisoners who arrived at the camp with a death sentence were subjected to pseudo-medical experiments. There are documented distressing photographs that depict the mutilated legs of young Polish and Jewish women, tragically referred to as the rabbits. These images serve as a haunting reminder of the suffering these women endured. These experiments were, in fact, tortures because they were often performed without anesthesia. One can only imagine the pain these female prisoners had to endure. Such experiments were conducted in many concentration camps, and they certainly did not serve the development of science. They were simply actions of humans' inhumanity humanity to other humans, simply evil. One man who exemplified the extent of Nazi brutality and evil was Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele and his companions performed different types of medical experiments, and many of these experiments were about compounding their knowledge of mass sterilization. Jewish women went through different kinds of tortuous experiments, including X-rays, drugs, and chemicals. These women would literally be cut open so doctors could see the effects of their treatments on the reproductive organs. Furthermore, people like Professor Dr. Karl Klauberg also conducted medical experiments on women in Auschwitz. While there, he attempted to devise grotesque methods of non-surgical mass sterilization that would forever scar his victims. Using a specially prepared chemical irritant, he introduced it into the female reproductive organs, causing severe inflammation. Within weeks, the fallopian tubes grew shut and were permanently blocked, rendering the women unable to bear children. Many of his subjects died from this experiment, while others were killed for autopsy purposes. Also in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, to study the extent of bone and nerve regeneration and bone transplantation, women had their bones, muscles, and nerves removed without the use of anesthesia. Most times, this led to death for the women. For the women who didn't die, the results were often intense agony, mutilation, and permanent disability. 5. Rape and forced prostitution. Women went through experiences that were unique to their genders. Acts of sexual violence occurred in a range of places, including Jewish people's homes, ghettos, hiding spaces, public areas, and even at the sites where mass killings took place. If the women are able to make it to the internment camps, their agony does not end, as the women were not just open to forced physical labor, but to sexual labor as well. A few survivors have come out to recount their stories. However, due to the stigma that often overshadows these stories, not a lot of women have come forward. First of all, the vast majority of the victims of these sexual violence were women, and the Nazi men were the perpetrators. However, even though there is no convincing evidence that shows that the men were specifically sent to rape the women, there is a lot of evidence that the soldier committed these atrocities. In many cases, rape was intertwined with the looting of Jewish properties. It served as a method of terror and torture, used to intimidate women and extract information about valuable possessions. If the offenders failed to find what they sought, rape became a tool of punishment. These violent acts often took place in or near Jewish homes, even with the victims' families present. Germans and their collaborators raped women in barracks, homes, and workplaces. To conceal their crimes, they frequently resorted to murder. Survivors' recollections shed light on the atrocities. For instance, Volksdeutsche Florian Koch, a guard in the Bodenivka camp, abducted teenage girls from their living quarters, violated and robbed them, and callously ended their lives. Gang rape was tragically common during the Holocaust. Perpetrator groups would invade barracks and assault young women in full view of others. Resistance often led to beatings or death. Some girls were deliberately selected for sexual abuse, and these selections took place in various settings. Survivors recall the nightmarish reality. Policemen would bring Germans who would brutally violate and dehumanize young women. Romanian gendarmes in Tulchin selected healthy girls, promising work but subjecting them to rape and venereal diseases. Tragically, many victims resorted to suicide or perished while resisting or trying to escape. Some rape victims faced even greater cruelty. Massacres of raped women were reported, while others were promptly killed if they contracted diseases or became pregnant. The physical and psychological toll was devastating, leading to further deaths and suicides among survivors. Leadership within ghettos and camps, along with guards, shamelessly abused their positions of power. They coerced women and girls into sexual acts by offering vital resources such as food, medicines, protection from deportation, or under the threat of harm to themselves or their loved ones. Clara, a survivor of the Kamianets-Podilsky ghetto, recalls how a policeman named Tchaikovsky exploited hungry women. He would only allow them to leave the ghetto if they agreed to engage in a sexual relationship with him. This harrowing reality was well known within the ghetto. Some men in camp leadership would hire young girls as house servants and coerce them into providing sexual services. Certain women saw their bodies as a means of survival for themselves and their loved ones. They initiated sexual relationships with powerful men as a form of self-preservation, which was referred to as sex for survival by Myrna Goldberg. Galina Klotzman, a survivor of a forced labor camp in Antonivka, recalls a woman who took matters into her own hands and engaged in sexual acts with someone in power, earning her freedom as a result. Semyon Dodik recalls the story of Olia, a young Jewish girl who managed to save herself from execution by providing certain services to policemen. Despite the post-war stigma surrounding women who engaged in prostitution, some of them managed to assist fellow Jews in ghettos and camps through their intimate relationships. Their connections enabled them to help others by bribing officials for goods or offering support. 6. Forced abortions and infanticide. In both the camps and the ghettos, the women were particularly vulnerable to all kinds of torture and rape. The most vulnerable were often pregnant women who many times will be killed on the spot for being unfit to work. Sometimes they will be forced to submit to abortions, or they could be sent to makeshift nurseries where the conditions were enough to guarantee the infant's death. Sometimes, the women were sent back to the regions where they came from, knowing that they had no access to food or medical care. The Nazis were so cruel that, for example, in Ravensbrück, during the final years of the war, women were allowed to give birth, but knowingly condemning them to a tragic fate. They knew the women were malnourished, so they allowed them to breastfeed their babies. But because of the lack of nutrients, the babies did not survive. In Auschwitz, Ruth Elias gave this account of her time there under the infamous Joseph Mengele. She said, "I delivered a beautiful big blonde girl, but Mengele ordered that my breast be bound so that, as he said, we can see how long a newborn baby can survive without food." She watched her baby suffer for days until a female Czech doctor handed Elias a syringe with morphine to end her child's agony. As Jewish pregnancy had been systematically outlawed, most women tried to disguise their pregnancies while a few of the women aborted their babies. Some of these abortions were performed under dangerously unsanitary conditions. In 1948, Dr. Gisela Perl, a Jewish doctor who was also imprisoned, testified before the Nuremberg trial that she delivered women at different stages of pregnancy with her bare hand. Working very fast, she accelerated the births by rupturing the membranes or manually dilating the cervix to invert the embryo and bring it back to life. Miraculously, and to the dismay of her peers, every one of the women she worked with survived their ordeal and was fit to work, which at the very least saved their lives at the moment. In rationalizing the policy of sending all visibly pregnant women and mothers of babies and young children to the gas chambers once they arrived at the death camp, Josef Mengele had this to say: "When a Jewish child is born, or a woman comes to camp with a child already, I don't know what to do with the child. I can't set the child free because there are no longer any Jews who live in freedom. I can't let the child stay in the camp because there are no facilities that would enable the child to develop normally. It would not be humanitarian to send a child to the ovens without permitting the mother to be there to witness the child's death. That is why I send the mother and child to the gas ovens together." 7. Forced labor. The Nazis exploited Jewish labor as a means of furthering their agenda. The ghettos and forced labor camps became centers of immense suffering and exploitation. The ghettos, such as the one in Lodz, were transformed into labor bases, with the Nazis opening numerous factories, 96 in the case of Lodz alone. The ability to work became a fragile lifeline, capable of temporarily staving off the horrors of the Holocaust. However, the value placed on Jewish labor by the Nazis was fleeting. Those deemed unproductive were mercilessly singled out, either facing immediate execution or deportation. To the Nazis, Jewish labor, even when forced, was considered disposable. The systematic extermination of the Jews became their paramount objective. As the German war economy faced labor shortages, particularly after their defeat in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Nazis resorted to exploiting the forced labor of enemies of the state for their economic gain. In the years 1943 and 1944, hundreds of camps sprang up near industrial plants, establishing a vast network of forced labor facilities. Auschwitz in Poland and Buchenwald in central Germany served as administrative centers for these operations. The Ravensbrück Women's Concentration Camp, originally established as a place of labor exploitation, held thousands of women who were subjected to backbreaking work and dehumanizing conditions. From its early days, Ravensbrück became a center where the labor of imprisoned women was mercilessly exploited. Construction of the industrial yard began as early as 1940, forcing between 4,000 and 5,000 women to endure grueling daily shifts of heavy labor. The exploitation extended beyond the camp itself. Women were also forced to work in the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or German Equipment Works, also called the DAO, near the camp, as well as German Experimental Station for Nutrition and Food Service, also called the DVA, and other agricultural enterprises not directly owned by the SS, to which the women were rented out. While a significant number of imprisoned women were tasked with maintaining the camp's operations, providing food and clothing, they were also subjected to backbreaking labor for the expansion of the camp complex. They were forced to construct roads and even housing for the SS. Women were deployed in the armaments industry, with the Siemens and Halski Group playing a significant role. Workshops were established adjacent to the campgrounds, where women were compelled to manufacture essential components for the machinery of war. They produced electrotechnical equipment for submarines, bomb-time fuses, and parts for the infamous V-2 rockets. Shockingly, girls as young as 15 years old were forced into this labor-intensive work. As the war progressed, the women employed at Siemens were housed housed in sleeping barracks near the plant. This arrangement aimed to minimize downtime caused by long walks and the risk of disease transmission from the main camp. However, the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions took a toll on the estimated 2,000 to 3,000 women, resulting in numerous deaths due to forced labor. To extract maximum labor output, the SS began sending women to external labor units known as Außenkommandos, or satellite camps. Some of these camps were administratively subordinate to other concentration camps, and the women were placed near armaments factories. In March 1942, Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Economic Administrative Main Office, declared that labor must be exploited to the fullest extent. As a result, working hours at Ravensbrück were increased from the original 8 hours, 6 days a week, to an exhausting 11 hours, 7 days a week. 8. Forced sterilization. A sizable number of the medical research that the Nazis carried out on women was forced sterilization. In a bid to find out the most efficient way to carry out mass sterilizations, the Nazis conducted various evasive and unethical medical experiments on women, including forced sterilization. Women were injected with formaldehyde solutions in their uterus, which caused intense pain and bleeding. Dr. Horst Schumann was one such Nazi scientist with a depraved ambition in finding efficient ways of mass sterilization. At Birkenau, a designated area was set up for Dr. Horst Schumann to conduct his horrific experiments. These experiments aimed to find ways to sterilize Jewish men and women through the use of X-ray radiation. In one of the barracks, Jewish prisoners were subjected to these experiments. Dr. Schumann tested various intensities and intervals of radiation, searching for the optimal dose. The consequences were devastating. The exposure to radiation resulted in severe burns on the subjects' bellies, groins, and buttocks, causing festering sores that refused to heal. Many subjects suffered complications and lost their lives as a result of these experiments. Furthermore, the experiences of female prisoners included the suppression of their menstrual cycles through the suspected administration of sex hormones. Ilga Chick-Kay, a survivor of Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Bergen-Belsen, recalls the absence of a single menstrual period throughout her imprisonment. According to a limited study conducted by psychologist Peggy J. Kleinplatz, the cessation of menstruation among female prisoners suggests the covert administration of exogenous sex hormones. Among the 93 female survivors interviewed, some attributed the cessation of their menstrual cycles to substances secretly added to their food. Recollections of a floating white powder known as brome or bromide circulated among the prisoners. Lily Malnick, a survivor from Belgium, worked in the Auschwitz kitchens and witnessed packets of pink chemicals with a texture resembling wet kosher salt. These packets were dissolved into the rations served exclusively to women, allegedly to suppress their menstrual periods. Dr. Kleinplatz suggests that the chemical mentioned by these women may have been exogenous sex hormones. These hormones, synthesized by German scientists Adolf Butenandt and Karl Klauberg, were manufactured by the German pharmaceutical company Schering in the early 1930s. Initially used to treat infertility among German women, Schering continued producing synthetic estrogens and progestins on a large scale during the war. Dehumanization and discrimination. It is important to note that before any of these events occurred before the Jewish women were sent to the camps or separated from their families, an essential step had to be taken: the dehumanization of both men and women. This is where propaganda played a significant role. Under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, the Nazis utilized propaganda as a powerful tool to shape German public opinion and behavior. In 1933, Hitler established the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, solidifying their control over information and narratives. Nazi propaganda permeated every aspect of society, exploiting existing stereotypes and resonating with its intended audience. Through sophisticated advertising techniques and advanced technology for that time, the Nazis disseminated their messages far and wide. Their propaganda campaigns fueled hatred and indifference towards Europe's Jews, playing a crucial role in advancing their persecution and eventual destruction. It created an environment that tolerated and even encouraged violence against Jews. Leading up to legislation and executive measures against Jews, propaganda campaigns sought to normalize and justify these actions. They promoted passivity and acceptance, depicting the Nazi government as a force for restoring order. In the twisted world of Nazi propaganda, no stone was left unturned in their quest to spread their hateful ideologies. From civilians at home to soldiers, police officers, and non-German auxiliaries serving in occupied territories, the Nazis employed various themes to manipulate and indoctrinate the masses. One recurring theme was the connection between Soviet communism and European Jewry. The Nazis portrayed Germany as the defender of Western culture against the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik threat. They painted a doomsday scenario of what would occur if the Soviets were to win the war. After the devastating German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, these themes became even more pronounced. They likely played a crucial role in sustaining Nazi and non-Nazi Germans, as well as local collaborators, to continue fighting until the bitter end. Films served as a powerful medium for spreading racial anti-Semitism and promoting German military superiority. In Nazi films, Jews were depicted as subhuman creatures infiltrating Aryan society. One notorious film, The Eternal Jew, directed by Fritz Hippler, portrayed Jews as wandering cultural parasites driven by sex and money. Newspapers, particularly Der Stürmer or The Attacker, published anti-Semitic cartoons that grotesquely caricatured Jews. The Nazi regime employed these cartoons to fuel hatred and dehumanize the Jewish population. As World War II unfolded, the Nazis intensified their propaganda campaign against Jews. They aimed to secure support, or at least acquiescence, for their policies of removing Jews from German settlement areas. Concentration camp officials even compelled prisoners, including those destined for the gas chambers, to send postcards home falsely claiming good treatment and living conditions. In June 1944, the German security police allowed the International Red Cross to inspect the Theresienstadt camp ghetto. This camp was established as a propaganda tool designed to explain the deportation of certain Jewish groups to the east. To create an illusion of benevolence, the camp underwent a beautification program. Tragically, once the film was completed, the SS deported most of the cast from Theresienstadt to the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center. Nazi propaganda proved to be a potent weapon, manipulating minds, inciting hatred, and concealing unspeakable atrocities. We hope that this video has served as an eye-opener to the plight of women during the Holocaust. Nowadays, there is a tendency for people to overlook history or neglect the significant contributions of women in shaping it. To quote Eisenhower once again, "The world must know what happened and never forget." In the spirit of never forgetting, click one of the cards on your screen so I can show some other important historical events that you totally need to know.